All right, so here we are back for part 2 of chapter 7, where we're going to get into the neurobiology of language and lateralization, because language processing is actually lateralized in the brain. All right, so we have this, so we're going to convert sound and things that we can hear, and we have developed language. So how have we developed this language? This is actually, you know, just sort of currently, being investigated in terms of the properties of language, critical periods, and um, and when people can learn it better versus when it's more challenging. And because there's a lot of individual differences, that some people can learn languages really quite easily and other people have a lot of challenges. So there must be some language acquisition device within the brain. And so a language acquisition device is a theoretical mechanism for humans to have the innate ability to learn language. And so this is this idea that, we can learn it, we have all these things, but everything that I went over, it's important for this, it's for this, and it is all of those things. And because of that, are we basically predisposed as humans? Do we have an innate ability to process and acquire and even create languages? And this is this idea that language then and sort of communication is a strength of our species, that there's elements of our communication and thought, and higher level types of things that we have not seen from animals. And so it's really postulated that a lot of higher level thinking actually evolved, in line with our language. So we have this theoretical mechanism. We're still trying to figure out what it is, but there is this general understanding that we do have an innate ability to learn language. It's just the mechanisms are not quite yet clear. So some of the areas that have been critical in helping to kind of delve into our language acquisition and development and production is Broca's area, which is in the posterior prefrontal cortex, which is right here. And this is postulated to be involved in language production and basically orchestrating the motor movements necessary to speak. Because when language involves, the communication elements, then the having an element of a shared language. And we know that the way we speak actually matters for elements of language interpretation, and speaking is really sort of the muscle movements that we really use the most. We are constantly engaging in, and not constantly, but really often engaging in interpersonal communication, whether it's the phone or any sort of online learning elements like this, that that the production of language and the acquisition of language, and that those are really intimately connected. And again, that's this idea that our ability to engage in super fine motor movements, and particularly within our hands and our facial expressions, because we tend to use these the most to communicate. I'm a pretty a gesticulator by nature, and so we have to have this combination of these motor movements as well. And so this is something that you'll be learning a little bit more about when you get into chapter 8. And so this is part of the reason that why this part 2 section is actually, of the chapter, is actually placed after chapter 8, because we'll be kind of heading into some stuff in there. So Broca's area was originally found, and it was termed basically this expressive aphasia, and this aphasia, meaning some sort of problem with aspects of speech. And so Broca's aphasia, you have a great deal of difficulty with speaking. you can hear and understand, so you have intellect comprehension, but it's extremely hard for you to actually produce language. My brother has quite severe aphasia after a very severe stroke, a number of years ago. He's actually really quite young. And so he like can sometimes speak in only one words, where like trying to get similar things, he can get my name, or sometimes someone similar, like he might say my daughter's name when he's meeting me, or he might say my name when he's meeting Sonali, or get me mixed up with my sister. So, but he'll, like, here, this, Sarah, how you, like very few contact words that are like, that link, that link the content words for meaning. So the sort of context is like is, are, all those types of pieces that you can kind of figure out the actual meaning of the sentence based on the content words. So you have a great deal of difficulty with that type of speaking. And so yeah, it's just very halting. My brother's is quite severe. And so he will actually really have trouble sometimes with really trying to like struggle to actually produce the word, even though he really knows what he wants to say. And he is like, his his brain damage is pretty extensive, but he was a really smart guy. And so it was definitely pretty, he has so much frustration in the fact that he can't speak well and communicate well. All right, so Broca's area, and basically observing people that had this very sort of like halting, couldn't get stuff through, really had trouble producing language. He, went ahead and sort of identified these particular areas. Now, the next is Wernicke's aphasia. So Wernicke's area is slightly different. So if you remember that the Broca's aphasia was right here, so Wernicke's area is back, sort of over here. And but I do want to say that the sort of like what areas encompass what is a little bit debatable in terms of how large or small they are. So Wernicke's area, may be different for, some people might consider it a little smaller or larger, and the same with Broca's area over here. So for Wernicke's area, sorry guys. Excuse me. Can't help it. So with Wernicke's area, it's just again above the auditory cortex, which is right here. And this is involved in speech comprehension and creating understandable speech. So Wernicke's aphasia is difficulty with comprehension. So they actually have receptive aphasia. They really can't kind of figure out like what you're actually like, what you're trying to say to them. And it can be, with its extreme, it can be quite difficult. And they speak in a normal pattern, but they actually do not make sense in terms of the words coming out of their mouth. So a couple of things from Wernicke's aphasia, in some great examples in Oliver Sacks' books. And there were, what used to sort of with these individuals while they were undergoing treatment, they would actually, would be staying at hospitals and things like that, trying to figure out some of what their conditions were, figuring out what these things were at the time. And he tells this story, Dr. Sacks tells this story of being on sort of the aphasia ward where sort of, working with these patients in these contexts. And they had one of the presidential speech debates on, this way, like, many years ago. And everybody, the staff and all that kind of stuff was watching it. But the Wernicke's like aphasic patients were like laughing and seeing something completely different than the complete sort of comprehensive hearing people in the room, such as the staff and stuff like that, because since they can't go ahead and really glean comprehension from words, then they actually really, really rely a great deal on body language to signal aspects of like intent and communication and things like that. And so purportedly, they watching the same thing saw completely different stuff because they weren't paying attention to what the politicians were saying. They were paying attention to what they were conveying with their body behavior. And then it was an entirely different sort of experience, and they were laughing at them and kind of like how they, in terms of some of their body behavior, were actually acting sort of like ridiculous. And, so just again, paying attention to the different ways that people communicate. And Wernicke's aphasia, when you're trying to speak it, it is sort of this word salad is a good description because it will be fluid and nonsensical. So it could, but it'll be said with a normal tone. So let's see if I can give an example. I don't know. Sprite, lively, home, dive. Like they would ask something that would clearly convey sort of an expression, a question where they would ask this. And then you would be not understanding, they would be, Sprite, clear, express, die, and like they would try to go ahead and convey this sort of meaning. And to them, what they're saying in their head is correct and sort of makes sense, but it's on its way from what's going on in the head to production that the challenges occur. And so it can be really yeah, it's really quite interesting to kind of see some examples of. So you might be able to see if there's any examples of that online as well. But I definitely recommend Oliver Sacks's text with all these stories. In fact, I think I'll probably post it as a bit of a link for the class. All righty. So next, well, we have this Broca's area, this Wernicke's area, how we're going to process our language information. And so the classic model of language is sort of based on and building upon Wernicke's area and Broca's area. And in this classical model, Wernicke's area gets information from the auditory cortex and uses memory for comprehension. And then it sends signals through the articulate fasciculus to Broca's area for language production. And so you can kind of see that right here, that sort of this would be Wernicke's area, and then this would be Broca's area. And you can see here that they have the arcuate fasciculus right here, sort of depicted as a pathway between them. And this is a nice sort of, breakdown too, if you're talking about, well, thought, then it would go to Wernicke's area. Broca's area stores motor programs, and then it would go to sort of facial area of the motor cortex and to cranial nerves. And, and you can see some of the areas that are the areas that are involved here and their proposed connections. And part of then the model then based upon this connection between them would postulate that you could have conduction aphasia, which is damage to the arcuate fasciculus. And this would involve the inability to repeat words or phrases that have been heard. This can also be also account for other types of memory problems, but that's a whole different story. So you would have conduction aphasia, which you would have trouble saying back things that you had heard. But there's a little bit of trouble with this classical model. And in that one, it's really based upon these older models where, and some of the research in terms of the way you're even thinking about dividing out the regions of the brain and kind of separating them based on cell structure and all that kind of stuff, these sort of histologies models, those are that's pretty far in the past. And then a lot of that stuff is not really shown to be too relevant in terms of the present day. So this looking at this classical model, people are also saying, well, there's some challenges here because the areas that are, as I mentioned earlier, that are considered Broca's and Wernicke's are not well defined anatomically. So then you really, if people are using different or like slightly different areas in terms of how they're defining Broca's and Wernicke's, that really matters a lot. And it's too focused on cortical structures on the left hemisphere and not enough on influences to language from deeper brain structures, such as the cerebellum and the right hemisphere. So we have, you know, within our comprehension, our language production, but then we have, again, all of these interaction spaces. You know, what about the way that we say the information, the affect that we use, you know, some of these deeper other types of pieces that influence our language in terms of aspects of our the frequency, you know, the sort of how rapid we're speaking, sort of aspects of arousal. All of those things can affect how, you know, you communicate the words that you're using. And so we need to figure out, well, this classical model doesn't really account for some of the way those things would be influenced in by other areas of the brain. And so the theory is that instead of the sort of classical model, that we should really be focusing more on identifying like connections, sort of these connectomes that we talked about, these sort of groups and sort of networks of neurons and cells that isolate the structure. And so basically coming up with this, again, is a language connectome. And so these are the various regions that are involved. And typically, like what you see in affect, for example, is that the pattern of activity across the regions that process affect in the brain, you know, can represent aspects of the affective experience. So if you have a language, more of a language connectome of the structures that are involved, then potentially sort of the patterns across these connectomes are going to do the same type of thing and contribute to more advanced sort of representations of language in terms of, you know, there's so much like behind what we say. Sometimes we're very deliberate with our words and there's a whole lot of thought behind them. That's complexities that the classical model doesn't really account for. Then next, so there's normally section 7.5 of the chapter. I have this break here because we are not covering that chapter or that section. The summer class is too short. And so I have left out the animal language section. Feel free to read that based on your interests. And okay, so now moving on to the section afterwards. So we're heading towards the end of the chapter. We're actually talking about language and hemispheric lateralization. So hemispheric lateralization is the idea that the left and right cerebral hemispheres take on different roles and cognitive specialties. This is seen in many other animals, including mammals and birds, and there are likely adaptive advantages to this. So social animal communication, split attention, faster reaction times. So for us as humans, the left hemisphere is more often the primary language production and speech production area in terms of our language production cortices. And the right hemisphere, on the other hand, is a bit more involved in visual spatial skills, which is the relationship between objects in three-dimensional space. And this is also involved in social communication for empathy and nonverbal cues and emotional interpretation. So you could see how if you're actually engaging in language comprehension, production, processing, that you would need both your left hemisphere and your right hemisphere. Often you're using language to communicate spatial relationships. And when you're engaging in communication, you often really use social communication, you know, cues such as you would receive from empathy and other types of nonverbal cues to guide how you would be engaging in your communication or language production. So this is some of the spaces that we have these specializations, but they're really designed to interconnect. And it is overall a myth that we have this sort of right brain creative, left brain logic. That's a myth. Let it go. That's not true. It's more just that we have these hemispheric sort of specializations, and that if you were being creative, you would need both sides, just as you would both sides for being logical. So, but these are the sort of their sort of specialty skills. And but the whole right brain, left brain stuff, are you a right brain or left brain person? It's a myth. All right, so these examples over here just demonstrate, or sort of purported to demonstrate, some of the lateralization effects, in the sense that if you look at these, they find that they're mirror images of each other, as you could see here, but sometimes it's the expression on the left, for example, that kind of sets the sort of the tone for what the emotional expression is for the full face, so so this, here, definitely sort of unhappier, and as you're thinking then about lateralization, potentially, your right hemisphere more involved in emotional interpretation, that's going to be processing this, this area of the face here on the left. So there may be an element of where you might see these types of things in lateralization, where the processing area is going to go ahead and give just a little bit of like, hey, I'll get you some of this emotional information pretty fast because it's here. And then you've got, then you can see the corresponding when you look at this, and then on the left-hand side, processed by the right, this has a greater determination that this face is perceived as happier and not quite as distressed. So this is a more distressed face, and this is a more happier face, even though they have the exact same pieces. It's just the way people tend to use the left side of the face first, or sort of not first, but the expression, if there's a difference on the left side of the face, can dominate. And you can only really test some of this stuff with these very particular controlled stimuli. It's not like you can go up to a person and have them be like, all right, smile, and and that would just look weird, so it wouldn't work at all. All right, next is a very, very cool phenomenon called hemispatial neglect. I actually love talking about this in class because it's just super neat, but this is caused to damage to the right parietal lobe due to injury or stroke. And it still happens. So it's basically to your right parietal lobe right here. I'm looking at the right side of the camera. So anything sort of right here, and your parietal lobe up here in this space, as we've talked about, it's this association area. It's going to be bringing in visual information, auditory information, aspects of spatial information. All of that stuff is going to be coming together. Visual information. So this is a key association area right over here. And so when you have damage to that, then what can happen is you have what's called hemispatial neglect. And what that basically entails is, again, your right side of the brain processing, what appears on the left side of the screen. So if you have hemispatial neglect, since you have damage on the right, then it's the left side that's going to be impacted. What happens is these individuals actually lose total awareness of any left side of their existence if it's really severe. It could be sort of a smaller portion and stuff like that, but they won't, if they're looking in a mirror, they won't put makeup on that side of the face. Like if they have a stroke or something, they won't realize any different. It will be as if that side doesn't exist. If they are shown that side, like through a mirror sort of manipulation, shown like this side of their face looking on this side, totally freaks them out. And they don't even know how, because again, almost this left-hand side isn't visible, then they don't even really have much of a, like, they can't even really turn left or even really orient towards their left, because these are the things that your association areas bring together. It takes all of the stimuli that you are perceiving from the environment and tries to put it into this comprehensive sort of whole space that we're interacting with. And if you have damage to that area, it cannot do it. And it doesn't happen as much with the left side to the right side, maybe because of some of the language production that happens on that side, but it is dominantly affected by the right parietal lobe. And it can be here. So these are just some examples of it. That if you give these sort of lines and tell them to bisect them, so like in the middle, you'll see that almost all of them are all the way, they're not in the middle, that they're more towards the right, and they can't even see any of the ones over here. And some of these they can bisect, but again, the more they get towards the left-hand side, the more they are, you know, like not even remote, not in the middle. And so this is just the test paper. You can see here that if you ask them to try to draw a clock, that they basically get half of it. And if you ask them to draw the house, they draw half the house. And if you ask them to draw the flower, they draw half the flower. If you ask them to close their eyes, picture themselves at home plate on a baseball field and report what they see, then they will describe first base, second base, sort of outfielder, you know, over there, maybe the center back. If you ask them to imagine a baseball field from the opposite sort of middle, I guess, like center outer field or something like that, at the very sort of opposite end, then they will actually be able to verbally describe the whole other side. So it's kind of there, but they can't, you know, access it in this traditional sense because the perceptual information is working. It's not a perceptual disorder, but this is basically in combining all of the sensory information together. That's where sort of the break occurs. So so it's like, and you can do the same thing if you ask, you know, if you ask them to describe, you know, the Monopoly board from Broadway, or I remember all the streets, and then versus going to the other side and asking them to take from this perspective, they'll basically be able to describe one half one way, and once they change perspective, they can describe the other half, but then they won't be able to describe the original half. So I hope that's not too confusing, but they can basically only get one thing sort of at one time. So even if you ask them, so maybe a better way of saying, thinking about the clock right here, if you ask them to think about the clock lying down, you know, and that they were on a clock face and they were at the 6th position, and ask them what they saw, they would go and basically talk about, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you know, 6, maybe 7, stuff like that. And then if you ask them to imagine being at 12, then they would describe 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, but would not be able to describe or see the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 that they had just described previously when they were imagining it from a different perspective. So very, very fascinating disorder that really just tells you a lot of stuff about the brain. Oh, and the other space is even using, if you give them 2 houses, so say 2 versions like this, and they are exactly the same, but one of them on the left side has flames, then and you ask participants with hemispatial neglect to choose between the 2 houses. So from their perspective, you know, they can only see the right sides of the houses, so they look exactly the same. And you say, okay, well, pick between the 2, which one you would want. They look the same, but they're like, well, pick between the 2. They almost always pick the house that is not on fire. And even though it should be equal, like it should be 50-50, if they're only getting information in, you know, from the left side into, excuse me, if they're only getting information in from the left hemisphere, you know, being, they're getting the contralateral stuff. They're only getting information from the right side of their visual field and not from the left side of their visual field, then they wouldn't even really be able to see or complain or like have any encoding of the fire that's on the left-hand side, but they do at some level see it, even though they're not aware of it in any way. So there is some information that is getting through from sort of alternate sort of pathways. And finally, looking further into lateralization, we have the Wada test, and this is a test that is oftentimes done before surgery, particular brain surgery. It used to be really common for it to be done in preparing for epilepsy surgery, because oftentimes the language center or near some of those regions can be involved in like have higher levels of like epileptic sort of seizure activity in those areas of the brain. And so when they're going to go in and try to potentially remove any of the scar tissue or anything like that, for example, that is that could be, having sort of like epileptic sort of unintentional firing, they can go in and remove that area. And once you have to remove the scar tissue, then the seizures will go away because the scar tissue is like not firing right. And but they have to test for which side of the brain your language area is on. And so the Wada test helps with that. So they basically, most of us, language is in our left hemisphere, but it could be in the right. And you definitely don't want to have, if your language area is in the right, you don't want to have it removed, because that's a whole, you don't want that. No one wants that. There's other, there's all sorts of stuff. If you remove your language area, then, we'll be getting that to a little bit later in terms of memory and stuff like that, of, removing parts of your hippocampus. But so what they do is they basically anesthetize one part of the brain, but with sodium, with sodium imbibarbital into the carotid artery, and then they will go ahead and ask particular language questions or tasks, ask them to do things, and then basically, based on what they can and cannot do, they can confirm whether their language is on the left or the right, and then proceed with, whatever brain surgery they need accordingly. Now, the other element of lateralization is that they used to do split brain surgery. So this is where you would cut the corpus callosum that, unites the two hemispheres so that they can communicate. And this was once used to reduce severity in like basically intractable sort of epileptic seizures that would often be sort of grand mal seizures that would spread from one hemisphere to the other. And so cutting the corpus callosum did not allow the spread of that from one hemisphere to another in terms of grand mal seizures. And so this isn't done as much now because there's other ways of treating seizures, so you don't have to, but you would often do this. And then what would happen is it would create two separate brains. And the left hand and the right hand would be able to move independently, and the two brains just really had a hard time communicating with each other since they lost their corpus callosum connection. So what would happen, and this is an example of someone who's had their corpus callosum cut here, is they have stuff that if they have two separate brains and they're focusing on this little middle and adult here, then the left side over here is going to see key, and the right side over here is going to see, the left side over here is going to see ring, and the right side over here is going to see key. And so objects presented in the left visual field are processed by the right and cannot be identified verbally. So so you can't really go ahead and speak some of these because of the different roles of the hemispheres that they're not communicating. If you have so in the left visual field processed by the right hemisphere, so this is sort of right here, and it's processed by the right hemisphere, but speech is in the left hemisphere, then you wouldn't actually really be able to label it as a ring. Excuse me. You wouldn't be able to say that out loud. Almost done with this chapter. This is actually the last slide. So there's been a lot of really interesting research on split brain patients, and they learn to actually communicate through their two sides of the brain, sometimes by saying stuff out loud so the other side can hear it, so that they can't really talk to themselves in the inside, and other times with hand movements and other types of things like that. So, and here's this, again, the language abilities is that objects in the right visual field, right over here again, the left hemisphere processing, split brain patients can easily name them. But again, if it's objects in the left visual field that are processed by the right, then there's no communication with the language center, and so they cannot name them. But what they can do is they can make the correct nonverbal responses. So if you see, if this person is sort of picking up the ring here, they can't name it, but they're like, if they're trying to show what it would do, then they might go ahead and be like, oh, here, and then like show that you would put the ring on the finger, so they would be able to do all the things that you would be able to do interacting with the object. And they will often usually be able to go ahead and pick it up and identify it based upon like its shape and things like that. So they can kind of, they can mimic things and things like that. So it's really actually pretty interesting, the kind of differentiation between the auditory and the verbal elements, and then what you can do with your hands, and if your two halves of the brain are separated. And this is a video that you can watch right here. And there's all sorts of actually really cool hemispheric split brain patient videos and stuff like that you can watch. Some of them are a little bit older, just in terms of haven't recorded a while back, but they're still pretty cool. All right, so here's key terms for the chapter, and we've got 2 pages in them, not too many, and that is it for chapter 7. So I will see you guys shortly or soon, later today or tomorrow, for chapter 8.